In this lecture, we will learn how to consume a promise. And in this case, we will consume the promise that was returned by the fetch function. So let's now implement the getCountryData function from the very first lecture, but of course this one using a promise. So getCountryData, and so again, here we pass in a country, and then here we will want this fetch function, and here again with the country then. So making this a template, literal again, and then country. And as we already know, calling the fetch function like this will then immediately return a promise, so as soon as we start the request. And in the beginning, this promise is of course still pending, because the asynchronous task of getting the data is still running in the background. So just as we learned in the last lecture. Now, of course, at a certain point, the promise will then be settled, and either in a fulfilled or in a rejected state. But for now, let's assume success. So assume that the promise will be fulfilled and that we have a value available to work with. And so to handle this fulfilled state, we can use the then method that is available on all promises. So just like this. So again, this here will return a promise, and on all promises we can call the then method. Now into the then method, we need to pass a callback function that we want to be executed as soon as the promise is actually fulfilled. So as soon as the result is available. So a function, and then this function will actually receive one argument once it's called by JavaScript. And that argument is the resulting value of the fulfilled promise. So let me call it response here, because this is the response of an AJAX call in this case. All right, and that's it. So this is how we actually handle a fulfilled promise. But now let's actually do something with the response here. And as always, I will start by logging it to the console. But of course, we also need to call this function here. All right. And so here we now get the response indeed. And even the type of this object is actually called response. Let's just get rid of this here for a second. So we have a cleaner output here. All right. And so here indeed we have a couple of things about the response itself. For example, here the status code or the headers. And so if you watch the lecture about how the web actually works behind the scenes, then this kind of data here will be familiar to you. But anyway, what we're actually interested in is the data itself. And so that data is in the response body here. So let's click here just to see. And as we see, the body is basically this readable stream. All right. And so actually we cannot yet really look at the data here. So in order to be able to actually read this data from the body, we need to call the JSON method on the response. Okay. So JSON is a method that is available on all responses of the fetch method. So what I mean is this. So response.json. So again, the JSON method here is a method that is available on all the response objects that is coming from the fetch function. So all of the resolved values. And indeed, this response here is in fact a resolved value. And so therefore, it does have the JSON method attached to it. Now the problem here is that this JSON function itself is actually also an asynchronous function. And so what that means is that it will also return a new promise. And that's all a bit confusing, and I really don't know why it was implemented like this, but this is just how it works. So anyway, what we need to do now here is to actually return this promise from here. Okay, because remember, this here will be a new promise. Okay, and so now we need to handle that promise as well. All right, and so the way we do that is to then call another then right here. So we need another callback function. This time let's call it data. And for now, let's log it here to the console. And let's give it a save just to see if it worked. And yeah, here it is. So here we are back to having the same data that we already had before, but this time using a promise. Or actually 2 promises. So let's recap what happened here. And the first part here, I think, is pretty straightforward, which is this fetch function here returning a promise, and then we handle that promise using the then method, right? But then to actually read the data from the response, we need to call the JSON method on that response object. Now this itself will also return a promise, and so if we then return that promise from this method, then basically all of this becomes a new promise itself. And so since this is a promise, we can then again call the then method on that. And so then again, we have a callback. And this time we get access to the data because the resolved value of this promise here is going to be the data itself. So basically the data that we're looking for, which is then this one here, right? And so now all we have to do is render country of data 0. Okay. And so here it is. So we just did the same thing as before, but using promises. And if we didn't have all of these console.logs here, we could actually simplify this a lot. So let me just copy it so that we get to keep this version as well. But then we can create a highly simplified version as well. So getting rid of this console.log and this one here. And then we can transform these here to arrow functions. And so this is going to work because this one will now implicitly return this result here. So this promise. And so then on that promise, we can call another then method. All I'm doing here is to simplify the code that we already had before. And you see that indeed it still works. So what do you think looks cleaner and nicer? Is it this code here using fetch and promises, or is it this function that we wrote right in the beginning with all of this weird stuff that we have going on here, and with this event and listening for the event, and even worse here with all these nested callbacks? So I hope that you agree that this here is actually a lot nicer. But beside being nicer, the code is also easier to read and to reason about. And as I mentioned before, that in itself is very important. So it's very easy to understand that this fetches something, and then we get a response, which will be transformed to JSON, and then we take that data and render the country to the DOM. Okay, so this almost reads like English sentences, and that's very helpful to understand the code now and also in the future. Now, just to finish, you might be thinking, well, we're still using callbacks here, right? And that is actually true. So promises do not get rid of callbacks, but they do in fact get rid of callback hell. So even if this doesn't look like a big change for now, it will look like a change after we add the functionality of loading the neighbor country like we did in the previous lecture. And so actually, let's go do that now in the next lecture.